The Holocaust and the course of the war. In this video, we will examine the Holocaust and the course of the war in the Atlantic and the Pacific Theater. The Holocaust. In his book, Mein Kampf, Hitler had revealed his plans for a new Europe, one with German domination and the extermination of Jews, Gypsies, Poles, and other groups. Once Hitler was in power, the situation of European Jews deteriorated quickly. Anti-Semitic propaganda was deliberately spread throughout Europe, and in 1935, the Nuremberg racial laws were passed in Germany, affecting all Jews. Under these laws, Jews were deprived of the German citizenship and were not permitted to hold professional jobs or marry non-Jews. In November 1938, the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris at the hands of a Jewish refugee incited a night of anti-Semitic attacks throughout Germany and a destructive rampage against Jewish homes, synagogues, and businesses. Jewish communities were forced to pay fines for the assassination, and thousands of Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. After the so-called Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht in German, the Nazi regime started actively discriminating against Jews and persecuting them. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Poland's Jewish population was forced to move into ghettos, restricted areas where Jews were sealed off from the rest of the city in terrible conditions of overcrowding, malnutrition, and a lack of sanitation and basic needs. In 1941, all the Jews in the Third Reich were required to wear a yellow Star of David stitched to their clothing. As German troops advanced into the Soviet Union that same year, Soviet Jews were systematically executed in mass shootings. By 1942, Nazi leaders had decided to implement the final solution: the complete extermination of all European Jews. Extermination camps like Treblinka and Auschwitz were constructed for that purpose. Jews from all over Europe were crowded in cattle train cars and shipped off to different camps. Upon arrival, the thirsty and tired victims were shaved, stripped, and sent to the showers, where many times men, women, and children were gassed to their death. Only a few of them were spared to work themselves to death in the worst possible conditions. Camp inmates slept in crowded bunks with poor sanitation and nothing to eat but stale bread and watered-down soup. Every day, they were forced to wake up early and stand for hours in meaningless roll calls in the sweltering heat of summer or the freezing Polish winter. The work was exhausting, and inmates often faced humiliation and cruelty, including beatings, starvation, and torture. 6 million Jews perished under these atrocious conditions. Other groups were also targeted and exterminated, including Poles, Russians, Gypsies, political opponents, prisoners of war, homosexuals, disabled people, and Jehovah's Witnesses. After learning about Hitler's plan for European Jews, Roosevelt summoned American Jewish leaders. However, few concrete steps were taken by the government. The War Refugee Board was created, saving the lives of several 100,000 Jews in Hungary in 1944. The American public only learned about the dimension and scale of this crime as American forces began liberating the concentration camps. The Soviet Union enters the war. A few months before the US entered the war, Hitler made a tactical mistake and decided to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. Nazi leaders believed that it would be a swift invasion and that Soviets would be quickly defeated. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union made rapid progress at first, but by late 1941, the Germans were stuck just short of Moscow, facing the cold Russian winter and a shortage of supplies and gasoline. The Allied operations in North Africa. In December 1941, right after the US declaration of war on Japan, Hitler committed another tactical mistake and declared war on the United States. Even though Japan's attack had prompted the US entry into the war, President Roosevelt decided to focus the war effort on Germany first. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill believed that the Americans were not ready to face Germany, and instead recommended postponing the operation until the American forces had more combat experience. Even though many advisors rejected Churchill's proposal, Roosevelt agreed, and the American forces landed in North Africa, where British forces were already fighting the Nazis. Stalin was expecting Americans to join the fight against Germany, giving a much-needed relief to the Soviet army. Roosevelt's decision to fight in North Africa infuriated Stalin, despite his promise of a landing in France as soon as the troops were ready. By May 1943, German and Italian forces in North Africa were trapped in Tunisia, and most of them surrendered to the Allies. The Allied invasion of Italy. In July 1943, American and British forces stationed in North Africa crossed the Mediterranean, making a successful landing in the Italian island of Sicily. Inspired on the success of the Sicilian campaign, political opponents overthrew the Mussolini regime and formed a new anti-fascist government. The new Italian government surrendered to the Allies in September 1943. But German forces took over the military positions once held by the Italian army. That same month, the Allies launched an amphibious attack on Salerno, on the Italian mainland. The landing was not as easy as planned, and the Allies suffered high casualties from the strong German resistance. The Battle for the Atlantic. The presence of German U-boats in the Atlantic intensified, disrupting American coastal trading and naval operations. Many vessels were sunk, and German U-boats even surfaced off the Florida coast. Americans understood the importance of keeping trade across the Atlantic and to reduce shipping losses. A stricter use of the convoy system was implemented. Merchant ships sailed together, escorted by battleships and air support. The Battle of Stalingrad. Germany and the Soviet Union were locked in deadly combat in the city of Stalingrad for about 6 months. The Soviet army had learned to resist blitzkrieg warfare by shooting from buildings where tanks could not reach and by fighting close to Nazi lines, making German airstrikes ineffective. In November 1942, the Soviet forces surrounded the city, encircling the German troops. Despite Hitler's orders to stand ground and not surrender, the last 100,000 German men lacking food and ammunition finally surrendered to the Soviets in January 1943. Only 6,000 of those men would eventually survive their condition as prisoners of war in the Siberian labor camps. The Allied invasion of France. President Roosevelt met with the Allied leaders Churchill and Stalin in Tehran in November 1943. At the Tehran conference, Roosevelt promised Stalin to start the long-awaited invasion of France by the spring of 1944. Stalin, in turn, promised to declare war on Japan once Germany had surrendered. American and British troops soon began preparing for Operation Overlord, or the amphibious invasion of France, under the command of General Dwight Eisenhower. A large number of men, supplies, and equipment awaited in Britain to cross the English Channel, as Allied airplanes repeatedly bombed strategic German positions in France, in hopes of weakening them. The Allies led the Germans to think that the invasion would take place further north near Calais. But finally, on June 6, 1944, after many days of bad weather, more than 4,000 ships and other landing craft crossed the English Channel, bringing Allied troops to the beaches of Normandy, in Nazi-occupied France. After this successful landing, the Allies moved east quickly, liberating Paris 2 months later, with help from the French resistance. Allies continued advancing at great speed until they reached the Ardennes forest and encountered a surprise German attack. The Battle of the Bulge lasted 6 weeks, and American troops suffered high casualties and great losses. The German offensive seemed successful at first, but Americans continued to fight with determination, despite the cold winter and the difficult terrain. African Americans saw action for the first time in the war. Reinforcements played a crucial role in the collapse of the German offensive. The Allied forces continued to push east, and in March 1945 crossed the Rhine River into German territory. The collapse of Nazi Germany. By 1944, German military technology included new weapons. Unmanned jets used to bomb Allied targets and V-2 rockets, the first liquid propellant rockets. These weapons were developed too late in the war and would not change its course, as Hitler had hoped. As Allied forces were crossing the Rhine into Nazi Germany, the Soviets were moving in from the east. By the summer of 1944, the Soviet army was crossing into eastern Poland. Polish patriots revolted against their Nazi rulers in the Warsaw Uprising of August 1944. The revolt was brutally repressed, and Nazi forces destroyed the city as they retreated. Soviet troops were stationed just outside Warsaw and passively watched the suppression. The Red Army then continued pushing west, occupying Vienna in March 1945, and then reaching Berlin in April of that same year. Hitler committed suicide at his Berlin underground bunker on April 30th, and German military leaders surrendered to the Allies on May 7th or 8th, which is known as VE Day, for Victory in Europe. 2.5 weeks before Hitler's suicide, President Roosevelt suffered a heart attack and died. The Pacific Theater. From December 1941 until early 1942, the Japanese successfully occupied Hong Kong, Burma, Malaya, Borneo, the Solomon Islands, Java, and Singapore. The Japanese forces then attacked the Philippines, then a U.S. territory. U.S. Commander General Douglas MacArthur first retreated to the Bataan Peninsula before receiving orders to leave for Australia. His troops continued fighting bravely until they finally surrendered in April 1942. The Japanese forced American and Filipino prisoners of war on an 80-mile march, known as the Bataan Death March. Several thousand men died from dehydration, exposure to extreme heat, and lack of water and food. The battles of Coral Sea and Midway Island. American and Japanese aircraft carriers in the Coral Sea engaged in battle in April 1942. Aircraft carriers from both nations were separated by more than 100 miles of ocean, but planes from each side flew and attacked each other's ships. The Battle of Coral Sea was the first of its kind. At the end, Japan sank an American aircraft carrier and severely damaged a second one. Next, the Japanese had a plan to surprise the American Pacific Fleet, destroy all of U.S. aircraft carriers, and take over the military base on Midway Island. American forces learned of the plan by partially deciphering Japanese naval code, and were able to prepare for the attack. The damaged carrier was repaired on time, and the American fleet was able to move out of the island undetected by the Japanese. As the Japanese started the attack, they were unaware of the U.S. Navy's position nearby, waiting to launch a surprise counterattack. American dive bombers destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, while they only managed to destroy 1. The Battle of Midway was a turning point for the war effort in the Pacific Front. Guadalcanal and island hopping. The Japanese began building an airfield in the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The future airfield would be vital in protecting Japanese bases and enabling Japanese planes to threaten Australia. 2 months after the Battle of Midway, American Marines took the island by surprise. Despite many attempts, the Japanese were never able to retake this island. Next, American forces in the Pacific began a strategy of island hopping, liberating some islands from Japanese control while bypassing others. By 1945, US had regained control of the Philippines. With Germany out of the war, all war efforts were concentrated in the Pacific Front, and even the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The US forces made a successful landing in Okinawa in April 1945, and were already planning the invasion of Japan's home islands. The Manhattan Project. Just before the start of the war, famous scientist and German Jewish refugee Albert Einstein wrote a personal letter to President Roosevelt. Einstein was warning the president that Nazi scientists were already working on a uranium-based atomic bomb capable of great destruction. Einstein recommended starting a program to develop an American atomic bomb immediately. In 1941, shortly after the Pearl Harbor attack, the US launched its top-secret Manhattan Project. At the Los Alamos Lab, the $2 billion project employed more than 6,000 people working at full speed. By July 1945, the first atomic bomb was successfully tested in the New Mexico desert. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Manhattan Project had been so secret that Harry S. Truman only learned about it after Roosevelt's death. As the US prepared to take the Japanese archipelago, a fierce fight from the Japanese was expected, one with high human cost, estimated to almost 1 million American lives. Based on these estimates, President Truman resorted to the atomic bomb instead of a costly engagement. He selected as targets 2 cities that were centers of Japanese military production. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was exploded over Hiroshima, and 3 days later, the second bomb exploded over Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on that day, once the US agreed to permit the Japanese emperor to remain on his throne. August 9th is remembered as VJ, or Victory over Japan Day. About 100,000 people died at each explosion, and both cities were destroyed. the war ended, and the world learned about the destructive power of atomic weapons. In the next and final video, we will examine the consequences of World War II.